Welcome to another episode of Vivid Noise, and today I want to talk about something that is simultaneously the latest thing I've covered on, I think, this entire channel, and also one of the oldest. It's Quake, but more specifically, the recent Quake 1 and 2 Night Dive Studios remasters. And I especially want to talk about the new level packs, Call of the Machine and Dimensions of the Machine. That's really going to be the focal point here because there's just something really, oh man, I can't even find the right word to describe it because I don't want to just say interesting, but really it does interest me. It's when an old game receives not just a facelift, not just a remaster, that's very common, but rather new content, new official content. Keyword being official, because any sized, any decently sized following is going to produce tons of custom content. Most games, many years old, still receive new stages, new characters, etc. But it's different when it's official. But let's not get ahead of ourselves here. Okay, let's first talk about the actual quality of these remasters. And yeah, they're Night Dive. They're really solid. At first, I was a little bit iffy when it came to the Quake 1 remaster specifically because there was just something about the movement, because this isn't the original Quake. I don't even know if this is a source port. This is running on its own thing. It's running on the KEX engine, I believe. The KEX engine. That's pretty funny. But it feels a little floatier, I think, especially when you're on an elevator and like you're going up really quickly. It feels like the view bob doesn't really match up properly with how the camera moves, but that's a very subtle difference. I'm pretty sure most people aren't going to be bothered by this. Other than that, it's got all the fancy schmancy modern features you'd expect from like a shiny new modern game, but over top of a very old game, and obviously it's very well optimized. I mean, how could this not run well on any computer made after like 2010? I've obviously not got the game cranked all the way up because some of the settings just look like ass. Like there's motion blur, like come on. Like I actually like motion blur for the most part in racing games and stuff, but in shooters, like any game that's first person, like no, no, especially when it runs this well. It's just useless because the whole point of motion blur is that it covers up the shittiness of 30 frames per second. So when you're at 60 frames per second, you kind of don't need it. I've also disabled ambient occlusion because it just, I don't know, it muddies up the image a little bit. And for Quake 2, you're going to see Quake 2 later on. I've also disabled the bloom because, well, actually, I don't mind bloom too much. I feel like it's well implemented. It's very tastefully used in the remaster, but just for the sake of, YouTube clarity, because YouTube, no matter what you do to the bitrate, even if you fucking render it at like 8K or whatever, it's still not gonna like it. The more, I guess, muddiness there is to the image, like how bloom introduces a lot of muddiness, it really just, it doesn't like it. Yeah, but other than that, the new weapon models are, they're not really new models. They're just, from what I can tell, they've taken the originals and, I don't know, maybe subdivided them a couple times and just smoothed them out. I'm not sure if it was done by hand or they used some sort of procedural system to do it, because you'd think that they would just straight up remodel them, and some of them look almost remodeled completely. But other weapons will just look kind of like, you metaphorically, what would be the equivalent, like a Photoshop filter or something, but in 3D, obviously. You get what I'm talking about. It doesn't always look like it was hand done, but generally everything looks fine. The animation interpolation is, it looks so surreal when you're actually playing it, although I do feel like it enhances the presentation just for the current day. Even though the chunky sort of, stop motion-esque animation of the original did give it a very unique look, which separated it from not just shooters of that time and its own sequel and everything. Although I do appreciate that pretty much all of these settings are completely optional. I really like the new tone map, like color tone map option. I genuinely have no clue what it does on a technical level, but what I can tell you is that the end result is just more varied coloration with the areas. Like, you enter a different area and the colors just shift a little bit. It applies this sort of real-time color correction, and it's very, very subtle. You almost can't even tell whether or not it's on, but when it is, when it's not on, there's just that slight lack of something, and you think, wow, okay, this looks a little more like how it used to, quote unquote, and then you turn it back on and you're like, ooh, okay. It does add to the aesthetic, and especially these new levels right here really benefit from it. And you know what? Let me get just the final things that I have out of the way as far as the just the quality of the remasters themselves. The Quake 2 remaster received something that I believe every single release of any game ever okay, no, that's a stretch, but when you're taking a game with level design that is as convoluted as Quake 2's, and this applies more so to the original campaign, not so much the new campaign that I'm going to talk about, but the original, they added a compass, and by compass I actually mean they added a GPS, basically, and it's the best freaking thing. I know that the fans might be divided on it, but hey, it's allowed me to play the game. I get lost really easily. The only reason why I was able to play through stuff like the original Unreal is just because I love that game's art direction so much that I just pushed through. But when it comes to Quake 2, like, just everything looks the fucking same, and it's just so hard to figure out where to go. You know, I've never been great when it comes to navigation, especially in first-person games, but I mean, I guess that happens when you grow up playing racing games where there's only really one way to go, and platformers where there's also usually only one way to go. Maybe there's like an alternate pathway or something. I'm not really concerned with whether or not the compass is a controversial decision. It made Quake 2 much more approachable, although I still prefer Quake 1. The art direction is more appealing to me. I find the game just generally more engaging. The level design is just more straightforward. Really, it's I don't want to call it a more arcadey shooter, but it's just way more pick up and playable. The weapon feel is also much, much better. Really. I had a whole rant about this, but I cut it. But to keep it short, the weapons in Quake 2 just feel sort of numb, and it has nothing to do with the lack of muzzle flashes in the original. Although, as you can see, the remaster has added muzzle flashes back in. No, it's not that. It's more to do with the animation. Maybe partially the sound design, because when it comes to gunplay, sound design is... it's like 70... I use 75% a lot because I don't like saying 90% because that's an exaggeration, but it's a huge part of the overall impact that a weapon might have. You really got to give it a good bit of punch, and some of the weapons sound a little dry, maybe just to do with the mix overall. I feel like they just could have been touched up a little bit, like the chain gun. Somehow the Doom chain gun, which is like 32-bit sprites, and Sound Blaster LGR will tell you in more detail type sound, you know, and yet that sounds way more powerful than the chain gun in Quake 2. Or even Quake 3, actually. Quake 3 Team Arena, I believe, added the chain gun. Well, no, it sounds pretty vicious there, but it's like the sound is good, but then there's something about the animation, the speed at which the barrel spins. You call it the barrel? I'm not sure exactly what you call it. The chain? Well, no, it's not the chain, but yeah, there's just something about the way it's presented that, I don't know, it really took them a while until they got the chain gun right again, you know, since Doom, which is just, well, actually, it's not that weird to think about. You got to remember that early 3D was just such an experimental period. So many games got things that they initially got right super wrong once they made the transition. Fortunately, most of those things that they get wrong are superfluous. Mainly presentation related stuff, like, you know, animation, color palettes, whatever it might be. I feel like the transition of 3D was kind of hyperbolized in terms of how difficult it was to do from a gameplay standpoint. Actually, a lot of games from that time still play fairly well. They might look like ass and maybe sound like it too sometimes, although there's definitely some massive exceptions there. But it really depends on the genre, I find. It's similar to how music and visual art sort of develop separately over time if you sort of track the history of them. Same thing with video game genres. You got, like, for example, first-person shooters, which needed, God, how many years to really become playable? Like, it wasn't until, like, Wolfenstein 3D, and then even that is kind of hard to go back to. And Doom, yeah, Doom is pretty damn playable. Racing games, man, those took until the early 2000s, very late 90s to really still be playable, primarily on PC because it was, or Dreamcast, because it was like the only thing that had enough power to make that kind of game work. Because the thing about a racing game is that not only do you need to have the shiny, pretty cars to please the manufacturers, but also you got to render, you know, relatively large environments very quickly because you're moving quickly. It's one thing to have the environment rendered and just sort of, you know, let the game take its time culling assets in and out and stuff like that, you know, boundary break type shit. And it's another thing to do that very, very fast. I actually talked about this in my Ridge Racer video, come to think of it, where I talk about how simpler games tend to age better and stuff like that, because that's true. Like puzzle games, people have been playing puzzle games since, you know, before computers were even a thing. You get the idea, like chess and stuff. So obviously when it comes to a puzzle video game, you don't really need much to still make it very playable. Frickin' Tetris, you know, etc. Breakout, I guess, or what was it? Arkanoid, I think. Is that really a puzzle game? It's more of an arcade type game, but still, whereas something that's a lot more elaborate, that will take more resources, and so fewer of them age better. When it comes to open world games, for example, honestly, I can't really think of many open world adventure action games, whatever, that are still at all capable to be gone back to before maybe Grand Theft Auto Vice City. And even that one can be a stretch. It's still a, you know, it's a classic, but it's definitely, open world games are that one genre where I feel they have really, really benefited from just all of the advances that have been made, not just in technology, but in game design sensibility. It really is sometimes just a matter of the mindset of a developer when making and what they've learned, their experience in the overall experience of the gaming industry compared to just, you know, how much power they have to work with. Well, obviously, the tools that they have can limit them in some instances and force certain decisions to be made. There's also times when, like, classic, absolutely classic example, like Mario 64, why kick you out of the stage? They literally prove within the same game that there's no technical reason behind that happening, other than maybe 1 or 2 stars. But no, they just do it anyway. And then Banjo-Kazooie was like, yeah, okay, we're not going to do that, and we're going to be a lot better for it. I think Spyro as well. Spyro doesn't kick you out of levels when you free a dragon, right? It's been a while since I've played Spyro. And in a weird way, this sort of leads me back to what I'm showing you right now, which is both Quake 1 and 2. Obviously, what you're looking at right now is Quake 2, and this is, what was that? What was the name of the level? Ruined Earth? I think it was the one before Wasteland. I thought it was like one of the more visually interesting levels, so I decided to show it. These two games are actually a really good example of exactly what I was talking about. Quake 2 may technically be more advanced, but Quake 1's design choices makes it a much more replayable game, in my opinion. I've never completed Quake 2. I just never had the desire to. The gunplay doesn't appeal to me as much. The visuals don't appeal to me as much, you know, as far as the art direction goes. Although graphics, you know, obviously they're a little bit better, a little bit. But the the stage design, well, I guess the map design, the pacing, it really is just less replayable. And I know it's just a matter of taste. I just happen to prefer more straightforward, easy to pick up, easy to understand games with, you know, less backtracking and more inherently satisfying gunplay, faster action overall. Quake 2 is still a totally solid shooter, and this remaster is great. And I think it's about time that I actually dive into what I really wanted to talk about and why I am using these two games as my source material, I guess, for this particular episode. And it's to do with, I already mentioned this earlier, and that is when old games receive new official expansions. First, let's go over how they look, and it's, I'm genuinely curious whether or not the developers, when they were making these, because a lot of these assets are clearly custom. I'm sure that, you know, some of the textures and stuff were just repurposed straight from the original games, but there's clearly some new textures here, and I'm curious as to how they did that. Did they simply take what would be nice, shiny, modern textures and then just, you know, decrease the resolution in Photoshop or something? Or did they actually find, like, these old, I guess, CDs with textures on them, like textures from the mid to late 90s, which would have been at that well, no, actually I was gonna say which would have been at that resolution, but that's not true, because most textures used from that time were full, you know, relatively high quality images that were then fucking crunched down to fit on the limited storage mediums and the limited amounts of VRAM at the time. So maybe, yeah, they just used those old textures that would have been high quality, and instead of leaving them high quality like they could have, because it's technically a modern game, they decreased them to like 256 by 256 or something. That is, I don't know, it's a really cool approach, and I'm glad he didn't actually decide to like try and make like some HD high resolution version of them, just to keep it classic. And as for the geometry, I really do appreciate the fact that they sort of, from what I can tell, mixed old with new. Clearly, a lot of these environments are quite a bit bigger and more expansive than what would have been possible in the original Quake engine. Oh, especially Quake 1, without a doubt. There's some huge maps. I mean, the one that I just showed you was pretty big. There's even bigger ones. But at the same time, they don't go completely nuts and make stages that are more akin to Serious Sam. Although, interestingly enough, when it comes to Quake 2, some of its enemy choices, the amount of enemies specifically, sometimes they can border on Serious Sam. As in, it's not in this level, although this level does have a ton of enemies as well. I had to restart like so many fucking times right here, which I obviously edited out because I want to seem like I'm better than I actually am, but I'm really not. But there's another level in this map pack that it has this one section where you open a door and there's like 15 fucking, you know, basic goons. And it's just like, what is this shit? Serious Sam? Like Painkiller? Well, for the most part, though, it is faithful to the way that the levels would have been designed back then. But I think what makes them especially fun to sort of explore and analyze is the fact that, well, these maps were made by, you know, a contemporary studio, Machine Games, and were made 20-something years after the games originally came out, and so much has changed about the first-person genre especially, and we've learned so much, and so it's really fun going through and seeing how much the developers have decided to try and keep it old school, quote-unquote, with certain placements of enemies and design cues and maybe even some kind of weird platforming sections, but at the same time learning from the 20-something years that have gone by and coming up with something that kind of marries those two aspects of design together, make it a little more streamlined especially. I can tell you right now that even though the compass that I talked about is an awesome addition, and I'm using it right now, you really don't need it that much for the newer maps for Quake 2. What was it? Call of the Machine, yeah. You don't really need it that much because they're just more straightforward, but not linear. I do appreciate that they're not just brain dead, you know, Call of Duty shooter. but they just don't have you going around in circles all the damn time looking for like, you know, 2 switches or something. I mean, I did actually have to find like 5 switches just now, but it was very, very simple to get to. And again, even if that's the great thing about the compass, it's such a safety net, and it kind of lets the developers really spread their wings as far as what they can do with the level design without worrying too much about the player getting lost, because there's always a way for them to figure out where to go. Although I imagine they probably tried to keep that to a minimum, because I found out through playing some different map packs in Quake 2, the remaster, that the compass isn't generated in real time. I assumed it was. It's not. It actually has to be mapped out for every level, because there were these demo levels which came with the remaster. They were these, I don't know, E3 pre-release sort of showcase stages, and the compass didn't work on them. You know, it would say like there's no pathing or something like that. Like it wasn't mapped out. Kind of like how in I think for custom Unreal Tournament maps, for example, you would actually need to have the bots tailor-made for those maps. You couldn't just drop just generic bots in there. And because of that, I'm sure that the developers tried to be, you know, they most likely didn't want to get ahead of themselves when it came to how they designed the levels, because they knew that if they made it more convoluted, then the mapping for the compass would have to be more complex as well. So they probably had that in mind, like, hey, let's not make these levels too complex, because then we're going to have a lot more work to do later on. Going back to the aesthetics of the new levels though, especially Quake 1's new campaign, I really do like how they clearly take at least some cues from existing games from that sort of time period. Like, I get a lot of Half-Life vibes actually, from some of the architecture and some of the art design, and a little tiny smidge of Unreal. You know, like the trio of late 90s first-person shooters, really, those being Quake, Half-Life, and Unreal. Quake 2's new stages, though, they are more, they stay a lot more true to how the original game looked. Obviously, the one I'm showing you right now is a little different. You don't see quite this many bricks, you know, this very brutalist, dystopian sort of architecture. It's really great, actually. It gives me some, like, Nuke, like the map Nuke, DE Nuke, Counter-Strike vibes. But the final stage for the Quake 2 campaign, as in, like, the new one, I really, really love what they've done with it. It's so different, so creative. It's actually really, really colorful, and it looks like nothing else that you've explored like prior to that stage. It looks like something out of a completely different game, and so there's some major Unreal vibes there, and I really, really appreciate that. It's a really nice level to look at. The new graphics engine really, really pops there, and it's also really fun. In fact, I think that makes this, it makes the level select all the more relevant. Yeah, there's a level select now in both games. Well, I'm sure that you could have technically had like a makeshift level select in the originals due to console commands. Like, I think with like the Gold Source engine, you can type in map and then, you know, C something, S something, like just random letters, and then it opens the map. Or with the Unreal Engine, where you type in open and in the developer name of the map, which is usually a little more, it sounds more like an actual name. It's not a string of letters and numbers, but it's something like, you know, open Chisra, for example, and it just opens the map that way. Here you have an official, properly implemented level select, and you know for a fact that I used it to get this footage. I wasn't about to play through the whole game to get to this point, although specifically with Quake, actually no, I think both Quake 1 and Quake 2's new campaigns have a non-linear open-ended level select, where you can just pick whichever level you want. So I could have actually done it that way as well, but, you know, I just used the level select. It's more convenient that way. I think if I were to try and properly sum up how I feel about these new campaigns, and not so much from an objective design standpoint, but just because if you can't tell, I look at games in a very emotional sort of way. The actual mechanics, the game part sometimes comes second. I look at games as art because games are art. I think a lot of us can agree that. And before you say, well, yeah, you think FIFA is art? No, here's the thing. You know how there's certain kinds of music which no one sees any art within that kind of music. I don't have to tell you. You can already think of a couple examples. Or with actual visual art as well. Same thing with video games. There's some games that are have a little more substance than others. And these games, I think, have tons of substance. And what separates these campaigns that I'm talking about right now from your typical mod is really the fact that it has that stamp of a professional studio. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's better, because there's so many examples of fan works that beat the shit out of anything that has been made by the original developers. I mean, as a Sonic fan, I should know that quite well, but that's not to belittle the official works. There's nothing that I can't stand more than, people who go like, hey, look at this fan game. Fuck you, people who actually make the games. Like, no, stop doing that. Although, yes, the developers should definitely learn from the competition, because, like it or not, fan games are a competition because they're free. So, if you got a fan game that's so much better than any of the official ones, why should you pay for the official ones when you could just play this free fan game that's really good? But sometimes the fact that it's made by an actual studio, even if it isn't the original developers, like in this case, can lend it this sort of, I'm not sure if the right word would be credibility, but this alternate universe type feel, I guess. As in, what if it had actually happened when the game was new? This is especially relevant to games that are quite old and have received some sort of re-release. I think Duke Nukem 3D got one or two, or I think it was just one new episode many years after it was initially released. It was in one of the billions of different re-releases of that game, and I think the original Doom kind of got that as well. But it was a little bit sooner after the game's release. It wasn't more than a decade afterwards. And also, did Blood receive that sort of treatment? It might have, I'm not sure. And now, for the most part, you generally would want just like an original IP to happen at that point. Like Dusk, for example. But it is really cool seeing an actual studio that has made games, on the market, tackle something that already exists in this way. It's kind of like, if I had to compare it to music, it would be when a more contemporary band, covers an older song and doesn't just try to mimic it, but gives it like this very new sort of sound. Like a couple years ago, 18 Visions released this cover album called 1996. It does have one original song on it, which is called 1996, but the rest of the songs were covers, but they weren't straightforward, just played a song. They definitely had like their own twists on them, and it was just so weird hearing like Nirvana with metalcore production. Although I'm not really sure if AT Visions really are metalcore. They definitely have that sort of element in their sound. And they went a little more hard rock later, and then they went more hardcore. I don't know, but it's just the production, right? Or hearing like Alice in Chains like that, or well, not so much of Metallica, because there's a Sad But True cover on there, but that album was so well produced anyway that, what can you do? It still sounds great. I think an even better comparison would be Northlane. They're a metalcore band, but with like this slight sort of industrial drum and bass sort of sound to them. I'm not even kidding. Like, their drum stuff is really crazy. And they did a cover of Get Free by the Vines, which is just this total, hey guys, remember Dun Da Dun Cha-Chucka Dun Dun? Remember Nirvana, remember the Beatles as well. The Beatles was a huge inspiration to those guys. But they did a cover of Get Free, Northlane did a cover of Get Free by the Vines, and it's fucking insane. Like, fucking Get Free with chung, drop tune to Doom level guitars. No, I'm not talking about the genre Doom, I mean Mick Gordon Doom. Getting back to official versus fan made though, I think the final point that I want you guys to take away from this, and what I'm taking away from this as well, is that the reason why official expansions to old games, especially, not so much with newer games because it just sort of feels like a natural continuation, but with old games is primarily that restraint, that commercially enforced restraint, because it's still something being sold, so they can't go too crazy, which gives it that more official sort of feel to it compared to, because a lot of fan-made stuff for games can either be very faithful to the source material and just try and be a subtle tweak or modification, or it can just be a completely original idea that just happens to use the some of the assets or the engine. Or other times it could be, that's the interesting thing about fan games though, it's like it's either that or it's the opposite. It's a totally unrelated piece of tech that then gets used to create something that tries to resemble a different game. Like for example, like all those Unreal Engine and Unity Sonic fan games, right? Like there hasn't been a single Sonic game ever made in Unity or Unreal, but there's tons of fan games like that because it's just easy to use. But then you got stuff like Poke 646 Vendetta, for example, which is literally just a Half-Life mod, but it might as well be an official game. It's really interesting how there's that dichotomy between those two kinds of fan works. And yeah, that's the kind of stuff I started conjuring up in my head while playing these two remasters. And thanks once again for joining me on this rather unfocused entry of Vivid Noise, though that's nothing really new for me. And I'll see you at the next one.